Good afternoon, and welcome to the 6th Robert Oakeshott Lecture. As most of you know, this is our annual commemoration of the work of our founder of the EOA and a celebration of the legacy he leaves, which arguably continues and is ever more relevant to today in business and society at large. I'd like to start by firstly thanking Cass Business School once again for their generous support of being a member of the EOA and for their support today. And to that end, I'd like to ask Marianne Lewis, the Dean of Cass Business School, to join us to say a few words. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Deb. First and foremost, welcome. It's wonderful to see everyone here today, and we are very proud to be celebrating employee ownership. In fact, events like today are exactly what I think makes Cass so special among the leading business schools worldwide, and that is this fusion of research and practice, of academia and industry, and this is an opportunity to learn with and from each other, so we're grateful for that. And I'd like to make a special thanks to two of our thought leaders at Cass who drive the work that helps legitimize, support, build knowledge that supports the EOA, and that is Professor Ajay Bala and Anish Banerjee. It's a pleasure to have you here, and the work of their research around the ownership effect is important because it shows the tremendous and continuing positive impact of employee ownership on the sector, both locally and much farther abroad. So wonderful to see, and I think my last comment is to also thank those of you who are friends and family of Robert. He would be very proud indeed. In talking with Ajay before, he remembers when this group was 30 members, I think you said, and it's now well over 600. So hoping that this just continues to flourish. We have a very special day today, thanks to our speaker, and I want to turn it back to Deb so that you can have a proper introduction of Dame Shirley, who we are so pleased to host here today. So thank you all.
Thanks, Marianne, and thanks as well to the team at Cass who've so ably supported us today. As I prepared for today and started thinking about what I would speak about, I started to uncover some interesting coincidences which I wanted to share with you. The first one is that a couple of weeks ago I was with some of our members at one of our regional events, and I was delighted to find out that it's one of our members, Bennett's Associates, who are actually the architects of this building. So those of you who have been around and with the EOA for many years will know that professional services is the fastest growing part of employee ownership in the UK at the moment, and that architects are strongly represented in that regard. So I really shouldn't have been surprised that the building we're sat in today was designed by an employee-owned company on the day that we're celebrating employee ownership. So that was the first coincidence. The second coincidence is to do with the support that that's so kindly donated today by our new trustee member, Sopra Steria, whose name you'll have seen on the invites and indeed you'll see on the screen behind me. A European leader in digital transformation, Sopra Steria provides a portfolio of consulting, systems integration, industry-specific solutions, infrastructure management and business process services. And with over 40,000 employees in more than 20 countries, it's quite possibly one of the largest IT companies you may never have heard of. I remember meeting the team from Sopra Steria, Martin and Karen are here today, and being quite embarrassed that I actually didn't know what Sopra Steria represented and how large it was and how much impact it was making in society. But of course, we were delighted when Sopra Steria chose to join the EOA. However, the second coincidence I came across was when I then realised it was the company that was originally founded by our guest speaker today that subsequently was acquired by Steria in 2007, with Steria then becoming one of the two companies that created Sopra Steria in 2014. So we've come full circle today, and that's just two coincidences. There are two further coincidences, but I suspect that Dame Shirley might actually end up talking about those herself, so I'll keep my powder dry on that. But before I do introduce and invite Dame Stephanie to the stage to speak on this really important day, I wanted to remind you why employee ownership is more relevant now than it ever has been. Those of you that are employee owners know that employee ownership puts people at the heart of the organisation. Its structures of ownership encourage and enable employees to take more responsibility in the business, and its culture of engagement and representation empowers employees with information to make better decisions. This unique combination of an ownership structure and an ownership culture then result in businesses that are more efficient, more productive and more sustainable. Employee ownership in its different forms and structures is more relevant than ever as the UK faces some of its largest economic challenges. Securing an independent future for the 5.7 million private businesses whose owners will be facing retirement at some point. Strengthening the supply chains and prosperity of regional economies and rooting jobs locally, and driving up productivity and performance of every business as the UK seeks to improve its standing in the global marketplace. At a time of political flux and global competitiveness, employee ownership can deliver greater business certainty and sustainability. At a time when some business structures stand accused of eroding workers' rights, employee ownership elevates the role and importance of employees. And at a time when capitalism is under scrutiny, accused of self-interest and excessive greed, employee ownership is the perfect antidote, offering a different form of capitalism where doing good and doing well in business are not mutually exclusive. Today is actually one of my favourite days of the year because it helps remind me why the EOA does what it does as we celebrate the life of Robert Oakeshott. Robert was a pioneer. If you look up the definition of pioneer, it says, and I quote, "A person who is among the first to research and develop a new area of knowledge or activity." Whilst employee ownership had existed for many years before Robert's time, it was he who had the vision, the commitment and the tenacity to create the awareness and support and advocacy required to start the journey of moving this innovative business model into the mainstream. And like many new ideas, the early adopters of employee ownership have now been joined by many more converts. In fact, we estimate there are over 300 UK businesses proud to call themselves employee-owned. Some of the most recent converts that you may have read about in the press include some very well-known brands, Lush Cosmetics, Riverford Organics and Sordays. But in 2018, we are still pioneering and are some way away from when every accountant, lawyer or funder is fully aware of the benefits and opportunities of employee ownership, and from a time when every business owner is able to easily access the support, advice and funding they need to become employee owned. But I quite like the fact that we're pioneers. We're not criticising other forms of business. Each has its place in the wider business economy, but we are clearly promoting something that is very different, and I would argue a much better way of doing business. So being a pioneer feels quite good because we have something new and something different to say. Which leads me smoothly, there's a good link there, to our guest speaker today, who is one such pioneer. After reading Dame Stephanie's book, I'm sure some of you have also read this, it really felt to me like Dame Stephanie was a long-lost cousin of the EOA. I couldn't quite, I couldn't put the book down, it is a real page-turner, but I couldn't quite grasp the connections between her story and the story of employee ownership. In fact, I just want to read one quote out, which I think absolutely sums it up. For those of you who've got a copy, it's page 273, and it's in the chapter called Letting Go, which I think for many business owners in the room probably has quite a lot of connection. And it's when she's describing what she thinks ownership is. The idea that ownership, like money, is more effective and more empowering if it is shared, which I think just sort of sums up everything employee ownership stands for. So I'm absolutely delighted to have the honour today to introduce Steve. So some of you may be looking a bit confused now. I'm sure some of you know the story of why Dame Stephanie Shirley ended up being known as Dame Steve Shirley. But for those of you who don't, and I'm going to paraphrase my version of what I think her story told me. When Dame Stephanie was an early pioneer working from home to establish her business, she encountered a challenge which anyone who's ever tried to start a business and get that first important meeting with a potential client has, which is getting through the door but being ignored. Her letters went unanswered until her husband suggested that maybe it was her gender that was causing the problem and people were not taking those letters seriously because she was signing them as Stephanie. So roll forwards, she started signing them off as Steve Shirley, and guess what? Yes, she got that all-important first appointment with that prospective client. And once she was there was no looking back. The stories of success, the stories of negotiation that are in this book are quite profound. But calling herself Steve was a major step forward to the success that she then eventually built for herself. Hers is really a truly remarkable story, both at a business level, but also a deeply personal level. So without further ado, I am absolutely delighted now to welcome to stage Dame Steve Shirley.
This Robert Oakeshott Memorial Lecture is given from my viewpoint as a real-life settler who, believing in the benefits of the moral and social benefit of co-ownership, for years spent years to take my company into co-ownership. Founded in 1962, it was acquired in 2007 by Stereo and is now part of the Software Stereo Group, currently joining EOA and our sponsors tonight. So I feel very privileged. Cultures are amazingly durable. We may not always know our fellow travelers, but we're on the same journey. I was an unaccompanied child refugee, so lack long-term neighbours and family. Perhaps that's why I was drawn to collective work, which also brings friendship and collegiality. From the Rochdale pioneers onwards, I feel part of the history of employee ownership. It's my great pleasure to welcome Robert Oakeshott's family and his twin brother and his niece, Annie Oakeshott, together with their spouses and personal friends. Thank you for being with us today. I met Robert Oakeshott in the 1970s during his job ownership days. He and I were born in the same year, and both, though not at the same time, at Balliol College. But he was far ahead of me in employee ownership. His book, The Case for Workers' Cooperatives, had a big influence on me. He had an interesting life generally, going to deliver medical supplies to an anti-Soviet uprising in Hungary. They later made him a hero of the revolution. A secret meeting with Nelson Mandela, at that time classed as a terrorist. And when in his 40s, a not so secret marriage, which was quickly annulled by mutual consent. My talk of employee ownership is of happenings and processes now well over 25 years ago. So I've forgotten much of the detail. And the legalities have probably changed anyway in the interim. But share planning was an important part of my company's 45-year life. So let me tell you about that company, speaking, as I say, from the role of the settler. To get past the gender issues of the time, as Debs has mentioned, I set up a software house that was female dominated. It was one of the UK's first such high-tech startups, a company of women, a company for women, an early social business. And we pioneered the concept of women returners, returning back into the workforce after a career break, and that's a euphemism for having kids. We pioneered a whole lot of new work methods, all kinds of flexible working, job shares, then profit shares, and later co-ownership, the reason I'm here. So I was doing lots of new things. I like doing new things and making new things happen. Though first mover advantages are usually grossly exaggerated, and innovators have to expect to long periods of misunderstanding. You can always tell ambitious women by the shape of our heads. They're flat on top from being patted patronizingly. In 1975, 13 years from my company's startup, Britain's equal opportunities legislation came in, which made it illegal to have our pro-female policies. And so as an example of unintended consequences, we had to let the men in. And that history is relevant because it led to an unusual culture, strong leadership from women, an emphasis on innovation and learning, and widespread positive collegiality. And we've referred to the few employees, many consultants, as staff. Let me give some more of the background. It was a service company financed by my own labour and later by taking a second mortgage on our home. Once it was established, I introduced twice yearly bonus system that worked for quite a few years, actually, until the 70s recession, when I had to send a series of letters to the staff saying, thank you for your work, the bonus this year, I'm sorry, is zilch. Hold that thought. We had tremendous contractual flexibility, min-max contracts, company commitment to offer a minimum number of hours work, staff agreement to work up to a maximum. And the much maligned 0 hours contract is an extreme case of this. So we were benign forerunners of the gig economy. We disguised the domestic and part-time nature of the work by offering fixed fees, one of the first to do so. And the balancing of fixed fees internally also allowed out-of-date staff to effectively fund their own training. And that's another step on their route to empowerment. I believe in 2 secrets of success. Always surround yourself with people who are smarter than you are. And any of my colleagues will say I did that. And choose your partner, any partner, very carefully. The other day when I said, my husband's an angel, a woman complained. You're lucky, she said, mine's still alive. If success were easy, we'd all be millionaires. But in my case, it came in the middle of family crisis and tragedy. Our late son, Giles, was a beautiful, contented baby. And then at 2.5, like a changeling in a fairy story, he lost the little speech that he had and turned into a wild, unmanageable toddler. Not the terrible twos. He was profoundly autistic, and he never spoke again And Giles was the first resident and the first home of the first charity that I set up to pioneer services for autism. And then there was the groundbreaking Prior's Court School for pupils with autism, and then the Autistica Research Charity, and my fee today goes to Autistica. Philanthropy is all that I do now. My cash donations total 68 million to date. I need never worry about getting lost because many charities would quickly come and find me. But co-ownership was the largest of my benefactions by far, because the company came to be valued at nearly $3 billion. To cope with the cash flow demands of growth, we started to gear paying the freelance consultants to when the associated invoice was paid by the client. And since consultancy formed the majority of the staff, that was great. But with their history of nil bonuses and such harsh payment terms, how could I not recognize the staff as the true stakeholders in the business? So I decided to entrust the company's future to the staff, their destiny. I wanted the staff who helped me build the company to a share in the success of the company, the success that they had made. And John Lewis was my prime example. It was really a model for me. And it seemed logical to develop the long-term, long-established profit sharing into share ownership. But what relevant legislation existed, and there wasn't much in my time, referred only to employees, so did not help at all with our many consultants. Guided by what is now the Involvement and Participation Association, I visited a number of employee-run companies in the UK and abroad. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain actually had a museum about their sector, as well as exploring other examples of proprietorial idealism, such as Bourneville and Port Sunlight. All the settlers seemed to be wealthy, which at that time I most certainly was not. And convened by Professor Keith Bradley, an interested group met several times in the London School of Economics to share approaches. I met the elderly Phyllis Pearsall, who had inherited the Geographer's Map Company, the A to Z company, and taken that into co-ownership. She was struggling with management succession at the time, but still working full-time and leading a medium-sized company, it was then, through a period of vast change. And I asked her, would you do it again? And there was an overlong pause, and then she said firmly, yes, I would. But to others, the answer might be different. The Saga family, for instance, took their company for the over 50s into co-ownership, and later they had to buy it back from the staff. Obviously, they would not choose to be settlers again. The late Lord Paul also went through a similar process with the Caparo Steel Company, the now defunct. Philip Baxendale sold his Baxi organisation to an employee trust at way, way below its value. And then there was a distressed sale, and the Baxi Trust was no more, to reappear again last year. And his name lives gloriously on with the Baxendale consultancy business, advising on employee ownership, and the EOA's Philip Baxendale Award. Stanislaus Yasakovich, later chairman of Merrill Lynch, initiated me into the financial mysteries of employee share ownership plans, ESOPs. That was in the US. And I spoke with several proprietors who had given away their companies, always concluding my inquiries with the same question, would you do it again? Most said yes, but I was struck again by the pause that preceded their answer. But despite the ups and downs of my experiences, I most definitely would. So let me tell you about why. The major tax problem, in my day anyway, was that if you give away a business, it's a gift, and the gift has a financial value of which the inland revenue want a slice. And the difficulty of determining objectively what that value is does not concern the inland revenue, nor does the fact that the value is all tied up in the business, and that to release it to pay tax would wipe the company out, and that makes it very difficult to transfer ownership without destroying the gift in the process. As a service company with a strong collegiate culture, we talked about the ownership possibilities for several years. I remember unwisely referring to a cooperative and one of my senior executives responding in a flash, well, if that's what you want, I'm off. And she walked out of the room. But I always celebrate the 1st of July, the International Day of Cooperatives, as well as Employee Ownership Day this year on the 29th of June. Back in the 19th century, John Stuart Mill ranked cooperatives as one of the two great changes that will regenerate society. The other change, female emancipation. And economists Sidney and Beatrice Webb thought they were bound to fail. But there's a middle position, and I thank the EOA for supporting the genuine article. Eventually, my colleagues and I did actually reach a consensus. And the chosen route was to set up a trust to hold shares on behalf of the staff. There's a lot of positive interchange. Robert Oakeshott wrote a book about the Scott-Barder Commonwealth. David Erdl, previously chair of employee-owned Tullis Russell, chaired our trust for many years. Some headhunters approached me about serving as a non-executive director of another employee-owned company, but their culture was union-dominated, and there was no meeting of minds on that occasion. Strange in retrospect, since I generally vote Labour, and though we live in Henley, an area of rabid conservatism. But I accepted with enthusiasm to be John Lewis's first ever non-executive director, and felt I was able to inject some strategic direction and absolutely loved my time there. It was a super company. Anyway, we had a consensus. So what happened then? Starting with a gift of 4% of the shares, we topped up the holding each year by amounts determined by gift tax considerations. That was the limitation. And that happened until 17% of the equity was held in that staff trust. And it made no difference whatsoever. The company still ran as a family company. Steve's company. And only at our Silver Jubilee, when I donated another 7% of the shares to take the trust's holding up to 24%, did the staff seriously consider that they might eventually control the company. You can see how the story is set to develop. However, trend is not destiny, and circumstances intervened. My Jowsey developed pressing needs so that I had to make a distressed sale of 10% of the shares. These things happen. We dream of 100% staff ownership, but that dream disappeared overnight. And the new institutional investors disliked the trust enormously, and there was an immediate presumption that the company would float. A nasty surprise for me in my naivety. And the trading conditions at the time made a float difficult, if not impossible. So for many years, we continued our corporate progress with things like shares as you earn, stock options, and at intervals, shares for the first time were sold to the staff, sold to the management, sold to the employees, and unusually, all the associated consultants. And eventually, 1 in 3 of the workforce held shares, plus many others who held a singleton share that I had given them to qualify them for share options, share offers. And it still didn't make any difference. It ran like a family company, Steve's company. So clearly we had to think more boldly. And having determined on staff ownership, the management, led by a professional in those days, agreed that we would offer 30% of the stock holding to the staff in an internal market. And there were 3 aims: to have negotiable paper in order to allow acquisitions, to focus people's attention less on our employment policies and more on the bottom line, and thirdly, to release to me enough cash to make me financially independent of the company. It's not easy being locked into a business, even if you are a paper millionaire. My initial plan was to sell the shares in 3 blocks. But my outside chairman, Sir Peter Thompson, who had taken the National Freight Corporation into co-ownership, persuaded me that if the intention was to stimulate a change in culture, it was better to do so in that one fell swoop rather than in the series of small steps that I'd been doing. And it is a pleasure today, as I talk about it, to see his son, Mike Thompson, the founder and now chair of the employee-owned child base here. Thank you for coming. My only stipulation was that the staff had to be keen enough to, between them, raise a capital sum equivalent to about 6 months' salary each. So we mounted a roadshow. We changed the Memonates to give double voting to current workforce share owners. And thus it was that 10 years after the trust's formal start, the staff directly owned 19% of the shares, twice 19, plus the 24% in the trust, gave 62% control to the staff. And that time, it did make a difference. A distinct sense of corporate excitement and a feeling of electricity in the air followed that double change, the relinquishing of my personal control to the workforce. How long did all that take? From concept to 62% control. over 15 years. And for many of which I was head down running the company, so was not blessed with much time. And progress was also determined by my having to pay all the scheme's legal and admin costs personally, since they related to my shares, and from net earned income, since I had no other source. Having got to that stage, 18 months later, I retired at 60. 18 months after that, I sold shares into a qualifying employee share trust that qualified for rollover tax relief. Notice how often tax comes into this. The internal market operated successfully for many years. Every 6 months, the average price of 2 independent valuations determined the price. And I acted to balance things out. So if more people wanted to buy than the shares were available, I made them available, and again, acted as a balancing. If staff wanted to sell, but nobody else wanted them, then I would buy them. So my view of co-ownership was of control. But just as the individual institutional investors wanted to see an exit route, so the staff interest was financial. And they pressed to get the value of the company recognized on the open market and shares more easily negotiable. And as part of that, double voting, which had never been popular with the institutional investors, double voting had to go. And when the company finally floated on the main exchange, I'd retired by then, the shares were well oversubscribed. Most of the top team became paper millionaires, as I had been for so many years previously. I look back at my several false starts and wonder why I didn't have the foresight or courage to transfer control much earlier. To be fair to myself, personal circumstances, not least the need to provide for our severely handicapped son, were an inhibitor. Certainly, I didn't fully appreciate the symbolic and psychological importance of my majority shareholding. And the truth was, neither having a few personal shares nor having an employee trust had made any significant difference to how people felt about the company. There was minimal risk for the individual, none insofar as the shares held in trust were concerned. And most importantly, there was no collective voice with the power to change the company. Staff had seen it as Steve's company, while Steve held the majority of the shares. And a whole host of things were applied to then maintain the staff shareholding. And they included a company personal equity plan so that people could hold shares in a tax-effective way. There was a company broker who provided good value share trading for the workforce. There was a company banker who lent money against the company's shares even before they were openly traded, and loans to new staff to help them get started on share ownership. There were various inland revenue approved schemes, all designed to help employees build up a meaningful capital stake over a period of years. I meant to bring some of the booklets, but I forgot this morning. I won't go into detail because even if I remembered them, all the information would be out of date. But basically, the schemes worked together and were always being updated to support the level of staff ownership. With tremendous effort, the schemes were later extended internationally and cumulatively were very successful. And when I retired, the staff's direct and indirect ownership was 26%, 25%. And 14 years later, despite dilutions from several major acquisitions, staff owned 30% of the enlarged, enhanced group. A few people understood my strategy of selling at the bottom of the market. One who did was the Financial Times journalist, Richard Asquith, which is why I later asked him to co-author my memoir, Let It Go. It is a memoir, not an autobiography, in that its facts are as accurate as I could make them, but the emphasis is more on the associated emotions, including my personal stress, disillusionment, and ultimate consummation. For my co-ownership dream was realized, albeit not in the way that I'd expected. My story brings up some generic points. The importance of learning from others' experience. And so congratulations to the EOA for bringing us together today. Using advisors to provide help, good, independent, legal and other specialist advisors are no longer pioneers, but are well versed nowadays in the approach. The UK is ranked as one of the friendliest countries in Europe in respect of employee share ownership, which has enjoyed cross-party support since the 1970s, and today delivers 4% of GDP, 4%. But the process can still be horrendously complex, making it hard for operational managers to understand the possible options and to choose wisely. And thankfully, the regime is now much more positive than in my day, and significant incentives are available to settlers. There's also the negativism of the tax regime, and I think that still applies. Because we had a week giving evidence to on our share schemes to the special commissioners seemed to me like being accused of wrongdoing with the presumption of guilt, though they did rule in our favour. And there's an essential need for management and staff to buy in. And for settlers to plan, not for short-term gain, not for personal gratification, but for long-term fulfillment. Like many entrepreneurs, the company was like a child to me. What to do with it long-term? My husband tacitly agreed that co-ownership was the ethical route to take, even though we could have got more money and significantly less hassle by just selling the company. But I'd never have been happy doing that. Co-ownership was the right exit route for me, especially with a service company, which I suppose we all are now. Employee share ownership was an excellent outcome for this settler. So, thank you, Robert Oakeshott, for your far-seeing humanity. With over 300 members and an aggregate turnover of well over 30 billion, the EOA is a wonderful legacy. It has been an honour to present this lecture in his memory. Thank you very much.